All right, we start with a special thank you to Rabbi Panitz, who's on tech today. Thank you. This is very exciting. Hi, good morning. Come on in. Okay, so there are sheets over on the side, and we're going to start. As we begin today, I want to invite us, as we do, if there is a person who you're holding in your heart this morning who could use our prayers for healing. Would love for you to lift up a name if you have one. Joe Schwartz, with continued love for our dear Joe Schwartz, and we will dedicate this learning to him. Joe's here. Hi, Joe. We miss you, and we can't wait to have you back on Shabbos morning. I hope sometime soon. Our continued prayers for refuah shlema, for healing of body and spirit. Okay, we'll start with the bracha for learning la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, welcome everybody. So I am very excited this morning, as always, for our time together because Purim is approaching. I wanted for us to do a deep dive into one of the pieces of Megillah Esther, of the story of Purim. And so we're going to be looking both at the text from the Tanakh, from Esther, and also at a series of passages from Masechet Megillah, from the Talmud, and a couple of other sources as well. But just to give you a little bit of background, a reminder that the story of Megillah Esther from the scroll of Esther is this really deadly serious story that positions itself as if it's a cartoon fable, as if it's a story of sarcasm and suspense, and it's literarily incredibly rich. It's a really entertaining story of love and lust and life and death. And it seems incredibly simple, but of course, the more you dig into the story, you'll see how deep it really is. A reminder for those who have not encountered the Megillah ever, or not since last year, it's the story of an indulgent, narcissistic, extremely wealthy king who has unlimited power, who is rash, who is reckless, who is unpredictable, and who is heavily reliant on his advisors, some of whom are extremely sinister. And the story that we read is what happens when Mordechai, the Jew, fails to approach one of those advisors, Haman, with the appropriate deference, according to what Haman believes he deserves, and how Haman responds when he believes that he's been slighted by Mordechai, the Jew, and is determining how and when he will take his revenge, not only on Mordechai, but on the whole Jewish people. So that's the backdrop that I will share with us today. And we're going to dig into the text. And as you can see, my source sheets keep getting longer and longer. But that's because we're not going to go into all of this, but you need to have it with you, in front of you. And I hope that the folks who are online have the electronic version of all of this together. So forgive me for going fairly quickly through some of this. And when you are here next Monday night, or wherever you'll be for Purim, if you're with us from afar, you'll hear some of this text read and lampooned rather quickly, but you'll know the deeper story. You'll know the backstory now. So we're going to start with Esther chapter 2, verse 21. At that time, it says, "Uvayamim hahem Mordechai yoshev b'sha'ar hamelech." Mordechai was sitting at the gate of the king. And there's a lot of backstory about how integrated Jews were into Persian society at the time of this story. And some scholars point to the fact that Mordechai the Jew was sitting at the entrance to the gate of the king, presumably in a position of some kind of power there, because they don't let just anybody sit at the entrance to the gate of the king. He is sitting there when he hears Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who are guardians of the threshold. These are actual guards at the gate. He hears them become angry, and they decide that they're going to do away with King Achashverosh. And Mordechai learns of this because he's positioned at the entrance to the palace, and he immediately tells Queen Esther, Esther, at this point in the story, in chapter 2, verse 21, Esther, the Jew who's raised in the home of Mordecai, is presumably his niece, though there are all kinds of other stories told in the Talmud about their relationship. Esther is a Jew who's been brought into the king's harem and then ultimately becomes the queen at this point in the story, but has been advised by her uncle Mordecai not to reveal that she's a Jew. And so she's there as a kind of undercover Jew in some sense. And at this point, Mordecai realizes that because he has this connection to somebody who's in the king's court, he can actually save the king's life by getting the message to Esther, and then the king will be protected from this mutiny or coup that Bigtan and Teresh have planned. And so he gets the message to them. The matter is investigated. It's found out to be true. And the two of them, Bigtan and Teresh, are impaled on stakes. This is a kind of visual that you can't escape in this story because it will come up again. And all of this is recorded in the book of Annals at the king's behest. So the part of the story that we're focusing on is when Mordecai, the Jew, saves the king's life by virtue of having been present at the entrance to the palace, where he was lucky enough to hear of Bigtan and Teresh's anger and their designs against the king. So I want to immediately bring us to the rabbinic response to Bigtan and Teresh. If you look now at Megillah 13b, and most of what we're looking at in the Gemara today is going to come from, as I said, tractate Megillah, from 13b and 14a. So 13b, Rabbi Yochanan, whom we keep hearing from in the course of our series together, says the following. He says, Bigtan and Teresh were two Tarsiim. They were two Tarsians. That's their ethnic or national background. They're Persian, but they're Tarsian. They're from this smaller ethnic group. And they were speaking Bilashon Tursi, in the Tarsian language, to each other at the gate. So two of the guards of the king happened to come from a particular ethnic group inside of Persia, and they spoke in the language of that particular ethnic group. And that's when they, in their rage, concocted a plan in which they said, come, let us cast poison in the goblet of the king so that he will die. Now, Mordecai is right there. And if you are plotting against the king, you make sure that nobody around you can hear what you have to say. But here's a guy who's sitting right there who may or may not be a judge, be a person of honor in that society, who at least can hear you. But you speak about it nevertheless in his presence because you are assuming that that guy who's seated in front of the gate doesn't understand what you're saying, because you're speaking in this obscure ethnic language, and that guy's not like us. He will not understand us, so we can plot and plan without pulling the batteries out of our phones. Do you know what I'm saying? But what they didn't know about Mordecai is that Mordecai was one of the people who sat on the Sanhedrin in the chamber of hewn stone in Jerusalem. And in order to do that, the judges, the justices of the high court in Jerusalem have to know all of the languages. They have to know 70 languages. So of course he speaks Lashon Tursi, but they don't know that. So the first image of the Jew that I want you to try to grapple with for a moment is the Jew who is identified as Mordecai the Jew. So he's enough of an outsider to this universe, but he's enough of an insider that he's Yoshev B'Sha'ar HaMelech, that he's seated at the entrance of the palace. He is seen by those who dwell in the king's court or right outside it as an outsider, but he's also a little bit of a shapeshifter because you think he's not like you, but then he understands you. Do you see what I'm saying? Like the Jew is a little bit of a sneaky kind of conniving, knows and sees more than you think. And I'm reminded of this story that someone shared with me some years ago about how she was a white woman. She was in school. She was seated with a bunch of other white kids, and they started talking about the Jews. And she slammed the table and she stood up and she said, "How dare you speak that way? I am a Jew." And they said, "Oh my God, we didn't know. You don't look like a Jew." And she said to me, the funny thing is she wasn't actually a Jew, but she became a Jew because of that moment. And she said she always thought about that comment, "You don't look like a Jew." And she thought that that was part of both the thing that would always keep the Jews on the outside and also our secret superpower. That she was both like them and not like them, that in her heart and soul, she discovered that she was a Jew, even though she hadn't been born a Jew. Okay. So Mordechai is he's both insider and outsider, already a person who can't really be trusted, right, by the people who are around him, because they can't quite figure this guy out. And of course, he has this secret connection to those who are in power because his niece, Esther, is able to get a message to the king right away that will end up having really great ramifications on the future of the kingdom, because the kingdom is not overturned at the plan of Bigtan and Teresh. Okay. Now we have to look at, for a moment, at why Bigtan and Teresh were so angry. Why do we have to look at that? Because I was really curious about it. Like, what angered them so much? They are living in the king's court. They have jobs. They're not unemployed. They have this position of power. And in Achashverosh's kingdom, and he's already been ruling now for many years by the time we get to this point in the story, he's a king who throws feasts that last for hundreds of days for everyone in the kingdom. They're eating and drinking and being merry. So why are Bigtan and Teresh so unhappy in this kingdom? And here you have to look at Malbim, this Jewish commentary, which I think is incredibly subversive and helpful in helping us address the question that I really want to understand as I look at the Megillah in these years, which is, what is this ancient text trying to teach us about the position of Jews in society, and what can we learn about it today? So listen to this. We're trying to understand why Bigtan and Teresh are angry. Mordechai sat at the gate of the king for two reasons. So he was seated there, he says. The first was that it would arouse the jealousy of the guards of the threshold, Bigtan and Teresh. For their anger was aroused. Why? Because Mordechai was seated there in a position of pomp and circumstance, while they had to stand on their feet to guard the threshold in the way of the simple people. Understand what's happening here for a moment. The text, Megillat Esther, tells us that Bigtan and Teresh, who have nothing to do with the Jews, who are just two Persians from a particular ethnic group, not Jewish, living under King Achashverosh, are angry at the king. And Malbim, a Jewish commentary, is telling us that the reason that they're angry is because Mordechai, the Jew, has stoked their anger because he gets to be Yoshev B'Sha'ar HaMelech, seated at the gate of the king, while they have to do the hard work of being on their feet, of standing and guarding the place. So Malbim seems to be identifying Mordechai as the trigger, or in some way the fuel for their rage at the king. Bigtan and Teresh aren't angry at the Jew in the text. They're angry at the king. And it seems like one of our commentators is telling us that the reason why is because they're mad that a Jew has privilege over them, a non-Jewish ethnic minority in the kingdom of Persia. If you're not unsettled yet, you will be, as we keep talking, okay? The second reason that Mordechai is sitting at the gate of the king is that from this very cause, God caused Mordechai to sit at the gate of the king so that he would know about the anger of the officers and therefore be able to save the king. The second one, which might trouble you less or maybe more, is that God, who is absent in the story of Megillat Esther, if you recall, God's name is never mentioned once, even though we're told that there are miracles happening in Megillat Esther in this story. The miracles come at human hands or in an invisible design of the Holy One but God is simply not a character in the story. And Malbim reads God into the story here, saying, God placed Mordechai the Jew there to be seated at the gate so that he could hear Bigtan and Teresh plotting to overthrow Achashverosh, so that he could tell Esther and save the kingdom, and perhaps also, providentially, so that it would be written in the king's annals, so that one day, when the king couldn't sleep and he's up reading the record, he would be reminded of this act of kindness that the Jews show, or that Mordechai the Jew showed toward him. So Malbim is reading two things into this text. The first is the somewhat problematic idea that the Jews are actually responsible for the unrest in Shushan that leads Bigtan and Teresh to want to overthrow their king, because the privilege that one Jew has awakens in them a kind of rage toward their government that makes them want to risk their lives to overthrow the king. And two, that God acts providentially in the story by placing the Jew in a position where he can hear about the coup, report the coup, overcome the coup, and ultimately be remembered for this act of kindness toward the kingdom, which will save the Jews in the end. Okay? Malbim. Now, any questions? All right, I'm going to go on. Text number 4. We're looking now at Esther chapter 3, verse 1. And this is where the Megillah gets, this is the moment that the kids are waiting for. Sometime afterwards, it says, Acharei hadvarim ha'ela. Sometime afterward, King Achashverosh promotes Haman, the son of Hamedata the Agagite, advances him and seats him higher than any of his fellow officials. Now, the way it's laid out on this source sheet, you might not realize how dramatic of a statement that is, because in fact, flip back for a moment, this pasuk, this verse, comes immediately after chapter 2, verse 23. So what happens here is that we learn that Haman is elevated in 3 different ways. He's promoted, he's advanced, and he's seated higher by Achashverosh. We've never met Haman before. We don't know anything about him. And what's very strange about it is that it comes right after another person engages in a truly courageous act that ends up saving the king's life, and that person is Mordechai. So Mordechai risks everything to get a message to Esther to save the king's life, and Haman is elevated to the chief advisor of the king. It's a little strange narratively, right? Because it seems like what this text should say is sometimes afterward, King Achashverosh promoted Mordechai the Jew. And so why is Haman being elevated in this moment is a question that we're going to have to grapple with. I want you to hold that in mind as we continue with the text. Now look at number 5. By the way, there aren't actually 25 sources on this source sheet. I just broke it down so it'd be easier for us to track and follow, okay? So text number 5 is Esther chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. So then all of the king's courtiers in the palace, this is a continuous narrative now. All the king's courtiers in the palace, they knelt and they bowed low before Haman, for such was the king's order concerning him. The king ordered that people would bow before Haman. But Mordechai, we know, it says, Mordechai lo yichra velo yishtachava. He would not kneel and he would not bow before Haman. And so the king's courtiers who were in the palace said to him, why are you disobeying the king? Everybody else is doing what the king said, to bow down to Haman, and you are not. And when they said this to him day after day after day, and he wouldn't listen to them, they told Haman in order to see if his resolve would still prevail, for he had explained to them, Asher hu Yehudi, that he was a Jew. Okay, so the question that I want to invite us to think about for a few moments is, why did Mordechai refuse to bow down to Haman, because this is, of course, the pivotal piece in our narrative that ends up shifting the course of the rest of the story. So why does Mordecai, what did you learn growing up? Why does Mordecai refuse to bow down to Haman? We have no idols. Okay, right. So Jill says because Jews don't bow down to idols. And that I also learned growing up. And it's interesting. It's actually, what? There shall be no other. Okay, there shall be no other gods before us. So it seems that the prohibition on worshiping an idol extends to worshiping Haman. I won't bow down to a stone. I won't bow down to a person. I only bow down to God, right? So the idea here is that Haman is trying to turn himself into a god, and we Jews will not, we won't play that game. We don't bow down to flesh and blood, except when we do. And we do often, not only when we're in Japan on vacation, but we also do in many different places throughout Tanakh. Jews bow down as a sign of respect and courtesy to the ruling authorities. And you can see it when Jacob greets Pharaoh, when he goes down to Egypt in order to be reunited with Joseph. You can see that Abraham bows down to the Hittites. There are numerous examples throughout the Tanakh of Jews bowing down to powerful people as a sign of kavod, of respect. That we're not making them into God. We're just honoring that they are humans who were humbled to be in the presence of. Okay, so the story that we were told growing up isn't sufficient. There's got to be more here. So what else could we think of? Why else would Mordecai refuse to bow down to Haman? And also introduce yourselves, because I think I know all of you, but just so that people at home can hear too. Yes.
I'm Marshall.
Oh, it's not working. Okay. This is Marshall.
Just from picking up the verse before is that Mordecai was passed over, so that he may be not bowing down because he's resentful.
There's a personal resentment here, right? It's possible that Mordecai feels that he was the one who deserved the promotion, and some other guy who we've never heard of before got it. And so because he has a personal history or resentment with him, he is wounded, he's resentful, and it's going to jeopardize our people, as we know. And when he's asked why, he says, Asher hu Yehudi, meaning because I'm a Jew, he's attaching his resistance to his identity. Instead of saying, because I'm the guy who should have gotten it, he says, because of my identity as a Jew. So in a way, I hate to say it, he's endangering his Jewish siblings by if Marshall's right, and his reason for not bowing down is a personal reason, but then he says, the reason I'm not doing it is because I'm a Jew, and I'm not going to fall for it. Now, in a generous read under that circumstance to Mordecai, we could say, what he's saying is, I'm a Jew, and I will not honor somebody who gets undeserved advancement in our society. This is a person who got an undeserved privilege, and I'm not going to honor that. And that's a Jewish value or Jewish principle. That could be the reason that he's saying that. But it seems like might be a personal anger that he has toward Haman. Okay, other reasons. Good. Keep going. Janet, did you have an idea? Okay, so I'll share with you a couple others that the rabbis raise. One of them is, there's a text from Agadat Esther that tells a story in which the Jews are in the process of rebuilding Jerusalem in the time of Ezra, and enemies of the Jews come and try to stop them. The Jews are becoming reinvigorated in their sovereignty. And enemies come and say to them, you have no right to do what you're doing. And the Jews say, we have every right to do what we're doing. And they say, well, let's go to the emperor and ask if we actually do have the right. And both the Jews and the enemies of the Jews send one representative. And in this version of the story, the enemies of the Jews send a man named Haman, and the Jews send a man named Mordechai. And I think what they're trying to say, and they end up, they go on this journey, and Haman runs out of food, and Mordechai gives him his food, but says to him, basically, I own you from now on. There's a long history in our families of resentment and hatred toward one another. You've tried to stop the Jews from realizing our own destiny, and now I will not pay you honor. There's also a characterological issue here, which is Haman and Mordechai are painted as fundamentally different kinds of humans. Mordechai is seen throughout the Megillah. He's like one of the only characters in the entirety of the Megillah who doesn't change at all. Everybody else, sort of everything flips on their head for them, and they grow and change. But Mordechai doesn't. He's thoughtful, he's loyal, he's reliable, he's always sitting at the gate. He's there. You know where you can find the guy. Whereas Haman is seen as impulsive, arbitrary, impatient. I have to mention here that Erica Brown writes an incredible volume on Esther, and reading it as a companion guide to the Megillah is really, I mean, it's incredibly rich and meaningful, and she brings a lot of these elements to the foreground. So if you're interested in reading and learning more, and I have great gratitude to her for being all of our teacher. Okay. So, but I want to go back to what Jill started with, which is about idolatry, because here's how the rabbis actually answer the question of why Mordechai would not bow down to Haman. It starts in text 6 with Rashi, who says, when it says we're testing him to see if Mordechai's resolve would prevail, it says, who said that he would never prostrate himself because he's a Jew, and was admonished against idolatry, al avodat elilim. So Rashi's hinting that it is actually about idolatry, but not exactly the way that we were brought up to think. Not a Jew doesn't bow down to an idol. Haman is making himself into an idol. But look at Ibn Ezra, who's playing with the same interpretation that Rashi is. He says he would kneel and he would bow. It's well known and established, as our sages of blessed memory have taught, that an image of an idol was wrapped up in his garment or in his turban. Meaning that Haman is standing there, everybody's walking by and bowing down to him. Here comes Mordechai, the Jew. He takes his little idol and wraps it up like this. And when Mordechai comes, he kind of exposes the idol, knowing that Mordechai will then not be able to bow down to him because Jews don't bow down to idols. And therefore, Mordechai, with whom he has maybe a personal vendetta, maybe a long history of tension, maybe their people had maybe just because they're people of different character, then Mordechai will be punished because he's now disobeying the king's command to bow down before Haman. So, okay. All right. Hold all of this. I'm giving you a lot of fodder. So then we go on to text number 8. So now we're at Esther chapter 3, verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordechai would not kneel or bow, Haman, it says, Vayimalah Haman chema. Haman becomes filled with rage. This is now the second time in the couple of moments that we've been studying that we see a character who is filled with anger and with rage. And what happens to us, I think the text is demanding that we consider when we become filled with rage, like Bigtan and Teresh, who make a very reckless decision to plot to kill the king and then to talk about it in front of a guy who happens to speak their language and understand them. What happens when we become filled with rage, like Haman, who feels disrespected by Mordechai? So for just a moment, we look back at another time in our text when there was rage. Before we started at the end of chapter 2, but in chapter 1, you might remember that Queen Vashti refused to come before the king, before King Achashverosh, and this made the king greatly incensed, and his fury burned within him. Vayiksof hamelech ma'od v'chamato ba'aravo. His anger burned inside of him. And Ibn Ezra speaks to that verse back in the beginning of Esther, saying, the king became very angry. His wrath burned. That the use of the word va'ara, burned, is not accidental. It burned inside him, flaring up like a fire. Ibn Ezra is warning us that Megillat Esther is telling us, when you are guided by rage and fury, as the king was, as Bigtan and Teresh were, as Haman was, as all of these characters were, because their dignity is undermined, right? Because they feel insulted and they don't know how to just do 4 breaths in, hold for 4, exhale for 8. So instead, they want to burn the whole kingdom down. And I just bring us very quickly to this text from Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto in Mesilat Yesharim, who says, when an arrogant person is insulted, by the way, it's Erica Brown who shares this, his heart is no longer with him. His judgment vanishes. A man such as this would destroy the entire world if it were in his power to do so. For he is not in any way directed by reason. He's devoid of he is as devoid of sensibility as any predatory beast. Okay? This is a clear and stark warning about what happens when we allow ourselves to be so insulted because someone has taken a swipe at our dignity, that our rage ends up becoming the thing that either threatens to destroy or destroys the whole world. Okay? I'm just going to remind you why it is that many people say that a reality TV star decided to run for president initially, right? Because he felt that he was insulted, that he became the brunt of the joke of the Washington insiders, and he had to show them that he was better than that, okay? That rage, uncontrolled, can burn down the entire world. Okay. Can we go back to the story now? Okay. Text number 12. Here we go. So what happens? Haman is furious because Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, having been told who Mordecai's people were. Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordecai's people, throughout the entire kingdom of Achashverosh. Now, what is happening here? Rava will say in Megillah 13b, Rava will say that actually in the beginning, all he wanted was just to kill Mordecai. But then he realized that that wasn't going to be enough for him, that he actually wanted to kill all of the Jews. And I want for us to understand that that move of generalizing from the individual to the group is the classic move of racism. Right? That act of generalization, and there are so many social scientists and psychologists that have written about this. I think that verse, in some ways, if you only remember one verse from the Megillah, this is the one to remember, chapter 3, verse 6, because don't we do this? And what happens when we do this? And what happens when this is done to us? How many people in this room have been held personally responsible for the decisions of Israel's war cabinet? I'm just curious, right? So we are seen as representative of any Jew who behaves good or bad, usually not great, okay? We are seen and held as personally responsible. And how do we do that to others? How do we look at other people and see them not as individuals, but see them as representatives of their people? And I want to just pause for a moment I want for us to take a little bit of time to think about this. I'm going to bring us to Tversky and Kahneman on this, but I'm curious how this lands for you. They say in text 14, people overestimate the degree to which an individual is typical of a class, and they underestimate the variability within the class. This, by the way, of others, we can see how much diversity there is in our family among our people, but others can't see that in us. And yet we do exactly the same thing when we look at other people. We see other people as a group that sees and thinks and behaves all the same way. We resent being told that there's a diversity of views and opinions among other people because it does not accord with our understanding of them. And this can lead, they say, to stereotyping, overconfidence, and decisions that are systematically biased against members of those groups. I'm guessing that everyone's has experienced this in this room. I wonder if anybody wants to speak to it very quickly. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Mary. Twins. Okay, thank you. So even from the tiniest pairing, we assume that twins are the same. And then how much the more so when it's not just two people with the same, identical genetic makeup, but it's actually a whole family or a whole community or a whole people, right? And I have to say that I remember not long after October 7th, it was either 1 or 2 weeks afterwards, when I shared that there had been a demographic study in Gaza at the end of September that asked the people of Gaza for their approval rating of Hamas, and their approval rating was like under 20% among the people of Gaza. And I shared that statistic from a very reputable researcher. And you would think, you would think that I'm like the worst traitor to the Jewish people. Because what did I do? I said, not every person is what you might in your pain and anguish want to believe that every person is. And let us not make the same mistake in looking at the people of Gaza that many people in the world make when they look at the Jewish people. And yet, while we want and need and demand that people see that in us, it's so hard for us to see that in others. I think that's a very clear and stark warning. Yes, your name. Right. Yeah. So Marcia says the same thing is true when all Jews are considered responsible for killing Jesus. Yes, Caroline. By the way, I spent some time last week in London, as some of you know, and some of the people were scholars and researchers who do this kind of polling. And yeah, there were certainly moments in the last 2 years where the numbers were really hard to stomach. And I think that meaning that the interest in democracy, two-state solution, peace, hit a kind of low point in the midst of war, both among Palestinians and Israelis, Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel. And there's also hope that once the violence has ended, that now we're seeing those trends shifting again. And so this is a very complicated story. What I'm trying to say is that it's complicated, right? That not everybody of any people can be identified as one thing. I don't want to be identified. I don't want to be aligned with, I don't want to be held responsible for the actions of Jeffrey Epstein, let us say, to go to the obvious case. And I think it's very fair for me to say, look at me as an individual. Don't generalize from his ethnic identity that all Jews are like this. So, okay, really quickly. Okay, we're going to do Kellen RBZ really fast, and then we're going to keep going because we have more. Yeah. Kiddush Hashem. Yeah. 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 This is important. So Kellen is saying, just repeating for the people who are with us online, that even though we want to be judged as individuals and not as a whole, there is an idea that Jews will be judged as a whole. And so you have to behave in a way that, knowing that your actions reflect on the Jewish people. So when Levi went to Model Congress in Washington, D.C., representing his Jewish school, and was wearing a kippah during his competitions, I said to him, "You remember, you're not just representing yourself and our family. People are looking at you and understanding what the Jews are." So both of these things are true. We don't want. It's not fair to hold us responsible for the actions of the worst Jews. And also, be reasonable, people. You will be. And if your name is Epstein, okay. So Barbara Zaki, really very quickly, RBZ.
Community and Jewish community into our conversations. We're all a mixture.
Okay, so but RBZ is bringing up that we all have multiple identities. And so especially when looking at the LGBTQ community, the Jews of color community, that the idea of generalizing the one to the men, it actually literally doesn't even make sense, because we are all a diverse mix and blend of lots of things. Okay, I'm gonna keep going because we have a few things that I must get to before I let you go today. Text number 15, chapter 3, verse 7. Okay, so I'm gonna do this part very quickly. What ends up happening is in the first month, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Achashverosh's rule, the lot was cast before Haman concerning that the very day in the very month of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. This is when they cast lots in order to decide what day the Jewish people will be mass murdered. It's a fun game. Pick a day. And by the way, it seems from the commentary that he kept picking and picking and picking until he got the day he wanted, because the rabbi said it was an auspicious day, because it was the day in the month of Adar. It was the day on the that Moses died. And so Haman, who knew all kinds of things about Jewish history, apparently, more than any of us knew that Moses died that day, so therefore it would be an auspicious time to attack the Jews. But what he didn't know, I'm doing this very quickly because I want to keep going in the story, was that Moses also was born on that day. And so, like for everything the Jews do, there's grief there, but there's also great joy. And so we're experiencing, so he picked the wrong day to mess with the Jews, essentially. Yes. That day's today. Okay. Today's the 7th. Okay. Okay. So now, thank you. Okay, so now quickly, you can look at that more closely on your own, but I want to take us to text 17 because we have to keep going. Haman then says to King Achashverosh, this is chapter 3, verse 8, "There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among all the other people in all the provinces of your realm. Their laws are different from those of any other people. They don't obey the king's laws. It's not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for deposit in the royal treasury." Haman has an enemy. Haman has a date in which they will all be killed. Now all he needs is to convince the king. And so he is going to do so in an absolutely brilliant fashion here. Because according to the rabbis in Megillah 13b, he's going to bring up every possible argument of why it would be in the best interest of the kingdom for the Jews to be killed. And so he will say, and the rabbis say, Rava says, there's no one who knew how to slander like Haman. He was so good at slander. So he says, we'll destroy them. And Achashverosh, according to the rabbinic imagination, in this piece of Gemara, says, I'm not going to kill them. I've seen what happens to people who mess with the Jews. They never win, right? I saw what happened to Pharaoh and all of his chariots in the sea. So I'm afraid of their God. I'm not going to do it. And Haman responds, just listen to, this is the rabbinic imagination, saying, don't worry, they've been asleep, yashnu, with respect to the mitzvot. He's saying, these Jews aren't serious Jews anymore. They don't even observe mitzvot. That connection that they had with God back then that made God take revenge for the people who went against them, it's over. And so you can actually attack the Jews now, and God's not going to take revenge on their side. And Achashverosh says, yeah, but there's still some Jews who observe the mitzvot. And he says here, again, generalizing, don't worry, they're one people. They're all the same. The nature of this people is that they basically don't take their Judaism seriously anymore. So you can target them, attack them, kill them, and God will not defend them. So then Haman brings the next argument, which is perhaps you'll say that I'm making a bald spot, which means I'm going to depopulate a certain area in the Persian kingdom, which is not good for a whole variety of reasons. Like, who's going to do the agricultural work if there are no Jewish farmers there to do the work? Also, who's not going to be paying taxes, which we'll come back to in a moment. But he says, but don't worry about that. Don't worry about depopulating the Jewish area because they are mefuzarim. They are spread out among all the peoples, the way that the Jews are. Wherever you go, there's always someone Jewish. We are all over the world. There's a Chabad literally everywhere, okay? So go, they'll be very nice, and you'll come in and they'll give you a meal. Okay, but perhaps you'll say, Haman says to Achashverosh that there's benefit from them, but they do good work in my kingdom. And what happens if I kill them all? But don't worry, they're miforad. They're like a barren mule. Nothing good grows from what the Jews plant in the world, okay? Maybe you'll say that there's one province that's filled with them, and therefore the verse says that they're scattered, okay? And then Haman continues saying, listen, this is a people whose laws are different from every other people. This is so good. Haman's very good at slander, as we've seen. They don't eat our food. They don't marry our women, nor do they marry off their women to us. They don't keep the king's laws, meaning they spend the entire year in what he calls here, how do we say it? He says, wait, I'm trying to find the way that the way it's written. Okay, they spend the whole entire year in Shechi Pechi, which is an acronym for it's Shabbos today, Shabbat Hayom. It's Pesach today, Pesach Hayom. Every day is a holiday. I was working with a family yesterday, and we were trying to find a date for their kid's wedding. They're like, anytime, end of September. So, and I'm like, you know about Chol HaMoed, and like, let me explain to you about Shmini Atzeret and why I can't officiate a wedding on Shmini Atzeret. Okay, and then the verse continues, it doesn't profit the king to tolerate them because they eat and drink and scorn the throne. And here's the proof. If a fly falls into the cup of a Jew, the Jew will throw the fly out but drink the wine. But if you, the king of this kingdom, touch the wine, that Jew will not drink the wine. And it's true. It's true that among the laws of kashrut, there is a ruling that says that if the hand of a non-Jew engages in the pouring of this wine, that a Jew is not to drink it. Haman's both extremely knowledgeable about Jewish law and practice, deeply cynical in his slanderous use of those laws and practices, and very convincing to the king. He's not completely wrong. This is something I just want to lift up. Like, some of the things that he's saying are really funny because they resonate, because I couldn't find a wedding date end of September, right? Some of the things are actually rooted in the halakha. Jews, some Jews really do object to interfaith marriage and aren't willing to marry their kids off to, like, there's something about this that actually rings true. Like any good piece of slander, it is rooted in some ways in reality. And even if you look at this text on text number 19, Rabbi Sharon Brous is having a conversation with his students, and he says, for what reason were the Jews hated in the time of Mordechai, so much so that Achashverosh wanted to annihilate them? And the answer that they say is, well, because they went to the feast of Haman and they ate treif there. Like, the rabbis are saying it's our own fault, right? Now, in different ways. These rabbis are saying it's our own fault because we were willing to eat treif. These rabbis are saying, hey, Jews, it's your own fault because you're not willing to drink treif, the treif wine, right? The rabbis are doing what we've seen them do so many times throughout our, throughout our dozen sessions so far. They're looking at Jewish pain, and they're saying, how are we responsible for this? What did we do? Malbim suggesting that the reason that Bigtan and Teresh wanted to overthrow the king was because it was the Jews' fault. It's like absurd. It makes no sense. And yet there's some kind of deeply entrenched Jewish instinct that says, maybe there's something we did here that we could have done differently that ended up leading to our own demise. Okay, I don't see any hands. I'm going to keep pushing forward because we got Janet really quickly. Okay, so Janet's saying that maybe the reason that Rabbi Kushner, Harold Kushner, wrote the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People is to sort of say, look, we have this longstanding Jewish instinct, or maybe human instinct, to see bad things happen and blame ourselves, and it might actually not be our fault, nor might it be God's fault, he argues. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Text number 20. Therefore, the king removed. Okay, so if you recall, if you go back for a second, so the last thing that happened in italics number 17 is Haman makes this great case before the king and says, here are all the reasons why you should do this. And by the way, I'm going to give you 10,000 talents of silver if all of my logic and reasoning isn't enough. And last year, I gave a sermon about this, this piece of the story, and I researched it. It's something like $230 million today. It's a lot of money. He's giving a lot of money to the king, saying, if you let me kill all of your Jews, I'll make you even richer than you already are. And I don't know, these kings who have everything suddenly will do all kinds of immoral things to get more of those things. And so basically the king removes his ring and he gives it to Haman, the foe of the Jews. And he says, the money and the people are yours. Do with it as you see fit. Now, Malbim here, I think in a very interesting take, the same Malbim says that actually the language that he says is he's lasotvo katov be'einecha, do what's good in your eyes. Well, maybe Achashverosh actually thought that Haman was going to do the right thing, right? Maybe he thought it was really for the good of the nation. I think Malbim's wrong. I also think, forgive me, that Steinsaltz is wrong. Because Steinsaltz is then going to go on and say that he was apathetic to the fate of the Jews, that Achashverosh was just apathetic, and that he really wanted the money, and so he gave over the ring. But I don't think this is right for two reasons. One, he doesn't take the money. He refuses the money. He says, the people and the money, keep your money and go do what you want to do to the Jews. And two, I don't believe that he's apathetic to the Jews at all. And this is the critical piece that I want to bring us to on the bottom of page 24. By the way, what will happen after Haman gets the ring is that he will decree throughout all of the land, every people, every man, woman, and child among the Jewish people will be massacred and exterminated. That's what the king has permitted by giving over his ring, okay? But I don't believe that the king intended that he would do only what was good for the people, like my taxi driver in London, who was an immigrant to London, an African immigrant to London, who was telling me, isn't it really good that Trump's cleaning up American streets by having all the illegal people leave the country? And I said, well, I have a slightly different take on it than that. And he said, well, I just trust that he's doing what's good for the American people. So that's what Malbim is saying here. I don't agree, needless to say. And here's what I wanted to lift up for us. And you've heard me share perhaps this Talmudic passage because I spoke about it last year in my sermon just before Purim. And so here we are at text 24, Megillah 13b. And the king said to Haman, the silver is given to you, the people also, do with them as it seems good to you. Keep the money and do what you want with the Jewish people, is what he's saying. And Rabbi Abba says, Achashverosh and Haman can be understood with a parable. So to what can they be compared? Now, they're two people, they're two neighbors. One of them has a mound of dirt in the middle of his backyard. The other one has a giant ditch, a hole, in the middle of his backyard. The owner of the ditch is thinking, how can I find somebody who has a mound of dirt who'd be willing to give me his dirt so that I can fill my ditch? I'd even be willing to pay for it. The owner of the mound says, if only I could find someone with a ditch so I could get rid of all of this dirt, I'd even be willing to pay them for it. And then one day, the two neighbors meet at the free lending library down the street, and they start to talk, and the owner of the ditch says to the owner of the mound, sell me your dirt. I want to fill up my hole. And the other one says, take it for free. If only we had met here sooner. Now, what the rabbis are saying when they say that Haman and Mordechai are like the owners of the ditch and the owners of the mound, I'm sorry, Haman and Achashverosh, thank you, Jill, thank you, is they're saying that Achashverosh, who up until this point has demonstrated no animosity to the Jew, right? Now, Mordechai may have thought that he might be he might have some animus toward Jews because he tells Esther, don't tell anyone. But up until this point, we've seen no hatred toward the Jews, and yet he's utterly delighted when he finds out that Haman has aspirations to destroy all the Jews, so delighted that he says, I'm so happy for you to take care of this problem in our kingdom that you can do it for free. Literally, Haman is offering to do the dirty work of the kingdom, to take the dirt off of the king's hands. I have this extra pile of dirt, the Jews. I would be thrilled if you would take it. And why would I pay you to take it? You're helping me out, right? And so what I always draw from this passage is that one man, Haman, even a very powerful man, who has a deep hatred, not only for Mordechai, but for Mordechai's people, for the Jewish people, is not itself sufficient to create the conditions for real danger for the Jewish people. It's only when Haman's hatred will meet up with a subtler brand of that hatred that's permeating in the culture, maybe subterranean, that our lives are truly in danger. And here, this person who we didn't know had any issue with us and who doesn't have a personal beef with Mordechai like Haman does, who has no reason to have any aversion to the Jewish people, who by all accounts are loyal citizens of Persia, including Mordechai, the one who saved his life, by all accounts. And yet, the instant he's given the opportunity, I don't know if you were in that conversation with Jonathan Jacoby on Shabbos afternoon, the kind of sexy, seductive, transgressive, subterranean, like now we're allowed to say out loud how we really feel about the Jews. I'm here for it, right? And that's what I think is the warning here in the Megillah, that this text, which is a parody, it's a spoof, right? It's a story of a fantasy, and it's actually revealing itself to be this really important, maybe counterintuitive truth about how precarious the position of the Jew is in history, particularly in the diaspora. And I think that that's a really critical message for us today, so much so that in Esther Rabbah in text 25, the rabbis say that actually what Achashverosh did was worse than what Haman did. It was worse than what he did. He must have hated us even more. And that's really striking. So I want to leave us. We have only a couple of minutes left, but I want to suggest there's so many moral messages here. But I'm going to try to thread together some of what we have seen, because right now you may or may not be aware there is a kind of fundamental debate that's raging in the global Jewish community about whether or not the safety and security of diaspora Jews is fundamentally tied to the actions of diaspora Jews and the actions of the government of the state of Israel. And to some people, even suggesting a connection between the two is a kind of blood libel. It's a kind of blaming the victim for our own pain. Like, why is it that we so quickly jump to how are the Jews responsible for the terrible things that are happening to the Jews? And other people say that it is absolutely essential that we examine the connection between the behavior of either certain individual Jews who are generalized then to be the Jewish population, or the behaviors and policies of the government of the state of Israel, which are fueling anti-Semitism around the world. And I see that tension even embedded here in the way that our rabbis are looking at these stories. because they could so easily tell this story as the story of an evil advisor, Haman, who decided he wanted to kill the Jews unfairly, and they weave the story through with elements of Jewish responsibility that make me really uncomfortable, but they're there for a reason, and I think we have to grapple with them. And at the same time, I think they offer us a very clear message about how the Jew who ultimately prevails in this story and is a successful model. Mordechai and Esther are the most successful model of diasporic Jewry, because at the end of the day, it's Mordechai who wears the king's ring, and Esther remains the queen, and the Jews of Shushan celebrate with not fasts but feasts. They turn a day of Avelut, a day of grieving, into a Yom Tov, into a day of joy. They give out packages, as you see around the perimeter of this room, of Mishloach Manot, and give gifts to the poor. This is a story of Jewish thriving. And at the very same time, we're being called to account both for the irrational hatred that is totally without cause that we will face throughout history, and also for the ways that Jews might be contributing to some of this hatred that we experience. And how do you hold that in a morally clear way, especially when you feel like your life's in danger, which is not a condition that generally lends us to open-hearted, vulnerable engagement. I think that they're inviting us not just to get drunk and feast and celebrate, but also to have a really serious conversation about the condition of the Jew in history. And I think it's as relevant then as relevant now as it was then. And the very last thing I'm going to say, and again, forgive me for bringing you too much so we don't have enough time for conversation today, is a very subversive text that comes in text 26 from Megillah 14a, just to close this off. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says, that moment when Achashverosh removed his ring to give it to Haman, that moment was more effective than the 48 prophets and the 7 prophetesses, or as some might say, the 55 prophets, who prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people, as they were all unable, all those 55 prophets were unable. They yell and scream and preach, and like Isaiah, run naked through the streets, trying to get the people to wake up and change their behavior, and none of them could do it. What worked? Achashverosh sealing the deal and saying, okay, you can go kill all the Jews. Because in that moment, the Jews put on sackcloth and ashes, and like the people of Nineveh before them, they repented. They changed their ways. And so isn't it interesting that anti-Semitism and the threat of annihilation and the threat to Jewish safety is the thing that wakes us up to who we are as moral characters? And what can we do better here, folks? What could we do better? So with that, I really am asking your forgiveness that I tried to bring too much. But I take this as fodder. I hope we'll get a chance over the course of the next week and into Purim to be able to discuss all of these things. I'm going to close now with Kaddish Rabbanan, and then I'll stick around for a couple minutes so that I can hear some of your thoughts that I want to let those who need to go to work go. Is anybody grieving the death of a loved one who wants to join me in saying Kaddish today? Okay. Kaddish Rabbanan. Yitkadal v'yikadash shmei Rabbah. V'yamad divrach yiratei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael. V'agala v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam u'me'omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shmei dekudsha brichu. Le'ila min kol berchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiram be'amav imru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidehon v'al Talmidehon v'al kol man da'askim ba'oraita di v'atra hadem v'di v'chol atar v'atar yehei lahon u'lechon shlama rabachina v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arachina v'zonei revichei for kanam mikadam avondi v'shmaya v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayin alinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'ramav hu ya'aseh shalom alinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Chag Sameach, Toda Rabah. Thank you all so much. What a joy to be together. Next Tuesday, no class because it is the Purim next Tuesday, but we'll meet again the week after that. Thank you, everybody.
One, how you doing?
Yeah.
Good. Thank
That makes sense.
Yes.
Thank you very much.